And even some latrines, the provisions were put there, but still other schools, they are not accessible. So we still have a big challenge.
Hoima Diocese owns many buildings in the district where it carries out many development projects, but most of them, including Bujumbura Catholic Church, are not accessible. Most churches in Uganda are constructed on hilltops with very many steps, apparently because the biblical Moses got the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai. Constructing churches on hilltops makes it difficult for persons with physical disabilities to access church services. Churches and mosques unconsciously discriminate persons with disabilities.
They want a person who is capable to do each and everything, unless it happens when someone is already professed or when someone is already priest. But when you are coming in the formation, it is just rare to see that you are passed through.
If somebody is disabled, can he be allowed to become a mufti, imam in such a mosque? Do you know something what the religion says? Says about disability?
For someone to be, say for example, for someone to be an imam, must be perfect. He must be having all the components of it. He must be fit. It is only in very rare cases if the disabled person is the only person who knows. Someone who has read and is above all the others who are following, then he can lead. But if there are others who are capable of leading and have read to a certain
Level standard.
then he may not lead.
It's in the Quran. So
it's in the Hadith, in the teachings of the Prophet. It is in the teachings of the Prophet, but not in the Quran. But as far as we are concerned, they have told us in the Quran that if there is nothing in the Quran about an issue, then look for the Hadith.
The teaching of the Prophet.
The teaching of the Prophet.
Hoima Diocese also owns St. Bernadette's Model School. This is an all-inclusive school that has over 30 children with disabilities, including the deaf, blind, and children with physical disabilities. Children without disabilities also study within this school. The school is fairly accessible because it has ramps, but headmistress Sister Justine Mwesige admits that the school toilets are not accessible. For a child to study well, all facilities at the school should be accessible. Florence Adong, a board member, narrates how she suffered because she could not access toilets at school.
But toilet system was bad because children were in a toilet. So what I used to do, I could not go to that toilet. I finish mine at home in the morning, then I go to school. I stay up to evening to come back at home.
Classic Nursery and Primary School is one of the best performing junior schools in Nebi, but the school is dangerous even to non-disabled children. Because of its good performance, parents are forced to enroll their children in this school. Apart from having very many steps leading to the school classrooms, the compound is rugged and full of rocks. This is where children risk playing. As we seek to talk to the school administration, this lady and man using tricycles get stuck at the steps because they cannot ride over. A few school children with disabilities like the blind and the deaf who don't have much movement limitations endure to study from the school. The director of the school, Dorothy Dugira, says they have bought land where they will construct an accessible school.
Because we have our side that we shall move to with the time, at least that one is level enough for all cases. Children with disability, at least that one is good enough. Except the problem here with it is a rented premise, the surrounding alone is not friendly for sure for children with disabilities. But we are trying, at least where those who have such cases, we do not encourage them to go where it is dangerous for them.
Another inaccessibility nightmare for persons with physical disabilities are the wells and boreholes. Most wells are located in valleys where it is very difficult for persons with disabilities to go and carry a jerrycan. While constructing wells and boreholes, there are some reasonable measures that can be taken to make them accessible. The public transport system is also inaccessible to many persons with physical disabilities. The taxi and bus parks are full of potholes. Most entrances and exits for pedestrians in the old taxi park in Kampala are full of stairs. During rush hours, persons with physical disabilities get stuck in taxi parks because they are weak and unable to fight for seats in taxis. In addition, the taxi and bus parks are so congested that it's hard for persons with physical disabilities using tricycles and wheelchairs to move within. Worse still, persons with physical disabilities with wheelchairs pay twice or thrice more than other passengers. One has to pay for his or her seat, for the helper or guide, and for the wheelchair. In developed countries, however, helpers and assistive devices are carried free of charge in airplanes, buses, and taxis. In taxis, trains, and buses and airplanes, there are special seats reserved for PWDs, children, the sick, senior citizens, and pregnant ladies. These special seats have different colors from the rest. Aeroplanes, buses, trains, and taxis are all accessible, but it's a different case in Uganda. At Entebbe International Airport, persons with physical disabilities risk falling as they are carried on stretchers onto and down the aeroplanes. However, Uganda's narrow roads characterized by potholes and narrow walkways are also a nightmare to persons with disabilities. The overspeeding and reckless drivers make it difficult for them to cross the roads. On Kampala Road, for example, there is only one zebra crossing where persons with disabilities can safely cross. Roads in Uganda are constructed without considering the accessibility needs of persons with disabilities. Uganda National Roads Authority is a new government department under the Ministry of Works, Transport and Communication. This authority is now in charge of road construction and promises to make roads more accessible to persons with disabilities. Uganda National Roads Authority offices are themselves not accessible to persons with physical disabilities. And since charity begins at home, as the saying goes, it may be a great challenge for them to make roads accessible when their own offices are not.
My name is Dan Alinange. I'm the Corporate Communications Manager of Uganda National Roads Authority. As you are well aware, the Roads Authority...
Accessing water transport and doing business on water is another challenge to persons with physical disabilities, as it is very difficult for them to climb and disembark boats.
How do I go to the farmland? Well, there are innovations. I've got quad motorcycles here on the veranda which I use. They are four-wheeled, so you can travel anywhere on the farm. They travel through the bananas, they can go over anything. So this is one of them that you are seeing right now. That is a 250 model.
Given an accessible environment, persons with physical disabilities can be productive citizens by participating in productive economic activities. Arthur Blick resides and does commercial farming across Lake Victoria. The former rally driver acquired the disability from a motorbike accident, but because of technological innovations, he is able to carry on with commercial farming, among other things. Peter Bashaija crawls to get where his tricycle cannot reach. He is a lecturer of electronic engineering at Balma College of Commerce and Technology in Hoima in western Uganda. A determined boxer, Bashir, is visually impaired but beats non-disabled boxers in the ring. He plays with Naguru Boxing Club. Charlotte McLean from South Africa is a World Bank consultant on disability.
It's fantastic. It's not fantastic, but I think it's improved considerably. And I think because, well, for two reasons. I think because of the South African Constitution that has disability in it specifically, We also have the promotion of education, promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act that has disability discrimination as an article. And then we also have regulations and building codes that require all new buildings to take into account accessibility. Plus, as you know, South Africa has ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the issue of accessibility in the convention is both a principle as well as a right. And it's a transversal issue throughout the entire convention. So I think we're beginning to see a lot more access in South Africa. Most new buildings, a lot of government buildings have become accessible. When I was at the South African Human Rights Commission, we did an audit of government buildings to see to what extent they were accessible. And I think that also helped raise awareness. So if you go to our parliament, for instance, our national parliament is accessible. Some of our provincial parliaments are also accessible. So I think there's a conscious effort to begin to address issues of accessibility. But there remain major issues around like low-income housing. You still find it's really difficult for people to access accessible housing. And I think if you live in rural areas, there are huge issues around access. Accessible transport is also a major issue, and that's very important for people with disabilities. Because without accessible transport, it means it's very difficult for you to participate in social life, to have a job, because it's difficult to get to work. So, we still have a long, long way to go in that regard.
McLean says that World Bank is so sensitive about accessibility and disability.
Well, the bank doesn't have a policy necessarily on, on accessibility in terms of disability. But what we try to do is try to look at what exists at a national level. So in the case of Uganda, ideally, we would be looking at whether Uganda has accessibility standards or a building code, and then that would be the premise that we would use that for the development of any kind of infrastructure that we engage in. The World Bank offices have tried to become increasingly accessible, and so most of our offices are now accessible to people with disabilities, and accessible both in terms of accessing information, but also in terms of the physical access. So there's been a lot of movement in that regard. The bank doesn't have a policy on universal design, and it's something that we're working on. We're trying to ensure that all bank projects would incorporate the principles of universal design. In terms of projects, we've engaged in some specific areas. Like for instance, there's a project that the bank was funded in Latin America, where we looked at accessible transportation. And there we not only looked at the physical point of it, but we also were training bus drivers around how to deal with issues around accessibility. So, some areas of success, but I think there's a lot more that we can.
Honorable James Mwanda is a UNAPD chairman and has traveled across the world. He says the accessibility state varies from one country to another.
Accessibility is not all that convenient to disabled people in many cases. Part of the reason is that many of their structures have been built for many years back, when I think issues of accessibility were not at the forefront. So you still find buildings which are not accessible. But I must say that in many public buildings, everything is being done to make sure that some ways are created for people with a disability to access services rendered in those buildings. I know in courts and if you like parliaments and other government offices, every effort is made to make sure that accessibility is created. And of course, those rich countries can afford to have lifts everywhere. You find that lifts are installed in many buildings, so you are able to move reasonably easily throughout a building because of the presence of lifts. when it comes to roads, there I think there's some improvement because many of the roads have accesses to pavements, and a wheelchair user will have no problem of crossing a road from one side to another, and the pavements are very well maintained. So from that point of view, things are good. Some cities, the buses are accessible. They've got ramps which wheelchair users can use to enter the buses and get out of buses. In some cities it's difficult. Many of the buses are not accessible. Or you find a few buses which are accessible. I was impressed in New York, many of the buses are accessible, including the underground. You can actually move in most parts of New York without any problem in a wheelchair. And I must say the bus drivers are very accommodative. They will wait for you to make sure that you enter the bus without too much hassle. And even the passengers will not complain even if it takes a bit of time for you to maneuver and enter a bus in a wheelchair. So it varies, as I said, from country to country, from city to city. And as I said, many of the old cities, accessibility is still a big problem.
Accessibility needs of persons with disabilities differ according to the categories. The blind don't see but have to move around with the aid of a white cane.
As a blind person, of course, we have a number of challenges. One of the challenges is because physically accessibility. You know, quite often people who are physically handicapped, they feel they are the only ones suffering from physical accessibility. But for us, the blind persons, if you have got a number of obstacles on your way, you find it very difficult to move. You use your white cane, you have to move left and right. You may find some ditches and so on. And if you are not well trained, at times you can miss and fall in the ditch or knock yourself, but you have to be extra careful. So a rough surface or a rough compound is a very big obstacle.
The deaf see, but they don't hear. They speak with their hands. They need guides and sign language interpreters to help them move and talk on their behalf, like on the streets, in taxis, and in the markets. In taxis, one has to pay for their interpreters. Their other main accessibility challenge is the inaccessible information. They need sign language interpreters everywhere, like in schools, hospitals, on televisions, shops and markets, to translate information for them. This is very expensive. Persons with physical disabilities have movement limitations, so they need ramps and lifts to be able to enter and move within buildings. The ramps should be wide, non-slippery and with a gentle slope. Entrances to buildings should be wide for a wheelchair user to be able to enter through. Toilets should be of sit-on type because many persons with physical disabilities cannot bend their legs to squat. They should also be wide enough for a wheelchair user to turn around. What should persons with disabilities do to change the inaccessible situation in the country? Accessibility legislations have been enacted, accessibility standards have been developed, and significant awareness about accessibility has been made, but still there is limited compliance. What is missing?
And thereafter, so government has a role, one, to make sure that the existing laws address the concerns that are raised in the convention. I look at Article 9 of that convention, which is talking about accessibility. It is so elaborate, and therefore as we look at our regulations that we are developing today, we would like to see that part of what is in that requirement is put in our legislation.
The executive secretary of the National Council for Disability, Julius Kamya, also concurs with Honorable Sulaiman Madada. The council is responsible for monitoring disability activities and overseeing the implementation of disability legislations and report to the government.
For us, as the National Council for Disability, that is an issue of rights and efforts towards equalizing opportunities. If the physical environment is accessible, then you have addressed a big portion of the rights of persons with disabilities. It is also an issue of policy and legislation. You have rightly said that the accessibility needs of people with disabilities have been partly addressed in the Persons with Disabilities Act 2006, in the Disability Policy. They have been addressed in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They are being addressed in many other laws like the Building Control Bill. There are efforts by government to make sure that the road subsector mainstreams disability in what they do. And for us as a National Council, as I told you, one of our main concerns is policy influence, to make sure that when such policies and pieces of legislation are being developed, we are together with other disability stakeholders to ensure that disability needs are well articulated in those policy matters.
A veteran disability activist, Asamo Grace Helen of the National Union of Persons of Disabilities in Uganda, or NUDIPU, says it's responsibility of the government to make places accessible.
Accessibility is not for people with disabilities. For example, when you go to Parliament of Uganda, before our members of Parliament went to that house, there was no ramp and there was no lift. But later, when the ramp was put on and the lift was put on, I bet you anything, I don't know how many disabled people pass through that ramp and through the lift if you compared with the able-bodied. So the able-bodied have also left the steps. So people's attitude of thinking that a ramp is for people with disabilities, I think is not the issue. Because a ramp makes life very easy for everybody to move very easily. You know, with the steps, sometimes you have, if you have a problem with your legs, you also will have a challenge, even if you claim not to be a person with disabilities. So the issue of accessibility is not only for people with disabilities, but it makes life easier for everybody in the community. So people should take from that point of view that putting a ramp doesn't mean you are putting it for disabled people. If you want to roll out heavy commodities from your shop and you have a ramp, you easily roll them out. So it doesn't mean that is only for the disabled. And of course, there are people who think that if it is for the disabled, then they are going to make it stiff. If you make it so stiff, like one time we go to Grand Imperial and you find the ramp was so stiff and you couldn't even use it, then you wonder, was it just a kind of foolery? Was it a laughter? Was it something like that? So I think also the way people put their ramps, they must consider that the ramp is for all of us, it's not only for people with disabilities.
The State Minister for Disabilities and the Elderly doesn't concur with NUDIPU.
In the Constitution is public-private partnership. And I want to say UNAPID can bring out proposals, but they can't legislate. They don't have this mandate. So it is us to take on what they have brought and see what government can chew and what can't be chewed by government. And we think this is a welcome move. We think that any other NGOs that have ideas to improve persons with disability, especially when you are talking about accessibility standards, we welcome them. And I feel that we are going to use them, we are going to discuss them with the other members of cabinet or other government institutions and see that they can be implemented. That's so welcome.
Honorable James Mwanda, the UNAPD chairman, says that to make Uganda accessible, disability laws that exist should be implemented. Persons with disabilities should continue to advocate for their accessibility rights.
Well, I think the problem here is that legislation is not adequate, and the little legislation which is there is not being enforced. For instance, I understand that buildings which are more than 2 stories must have working lifts. But City Council will give occupation permits to buildings which have more than 2 stories, and those buildings are open for business, and they are not accessible, there are no lifts, and disabled people are disadvantaged. They cannot access the services offered in those buildings. Now, for instance, the office of the Registrar General in a government, which is located on the 5th floor of Amama building, has no lift. There is a lift, but that lift has never worked for a long time. And since most people are able-bodied, they can walk up and down the stairs. It has never occurred to people that a disabled person may wish to go and register a business, or may wish to go and register birth or death or whatever. And it's most unfortunate that this is allowed to continue without anybody raising objection to this kind of situation. Now, we are aware that the government of Uganda is coming up with the breeding control bill, but there is some kind of mystery which nobody understands. Whenever you inquire, you don't know whether the bill is still in the drawer of the minister or permanent secretary or has reached cabinet, or you don't know, and nobody will give you the true situation of this bill. And as a result, disabled people continue suffering just because people in the government are not doing what they are supposed to do. So this is the tragedy of the situation. As long as people believe that they can walk and go to places and reach wherever they want to go, they don't realize that 10% of the population of Uganda has difficulties of mobility, and therefore accessibility has got to be looked into, and adequate laws have got to be put in place to enable them to enjoy the services and the rights which everybody enjoys. But UNAPID is committed to ensuring that some of the things which should be done and have not been done will be done, because we are going to put pressure to everybody concerned to ensure that appropriate laws are put in place and enforcement is also effective.
Despite the achievements of the project, we still have a long way to go. From today, tomorrow, what are the future plans of this project? One of the most important future plans of this project, which is most immediate, is the launch of our accessibility standards, which are going to be very soon be launched so that it becomes a national tool. The standards are not a NAPID document, but this is a national document to guide the public and service providers in the country to ensure that services are accessible to persons with disabilities in general.
I appeal to our donors to keep supporting us. I know this project is running for 2 years, up to 2010. I call upon them to continue supporting us so that we extend this project beyond 8 districts.
Everybody is responsible for making places accessible. Support Uganda National Action on Physical Disability in this fight. Begin with your home, as in everyone's life, there is a possibility of acquiring a disability. Accessibility benefits not only persons with disability, but everybody. Accessibility is by law, not a favor. Make places accessible now.
Teka za mukama bwezi kyona yete tulina kyetwakula tuli bantu gambwe naye ekyobusosoze kitunyiza kitumalamu amaanyi kyetubasaba mu kikomerero fete tulina kyetwasobya enteekateeka za mukama bwezi kyona yete tulina kyetwakola tuli bantu gambwe naye ekyobusosoze kitunyiza kitumalamu amaanyi kyetubasaba mu kikomerero